Are we confusing two different concepts of God? Over the last few weeks, I've posted a few videos discussing such things as the classical arguments for the existence of God, particularly the arguments from design and causality. And this has provoked quite a lot of discussion, which surprised me somewhat and really pleased me. The process of presenting these videos and the discussion that's ensued have certainly helped me to add clarity and nuance to my own thoughts on this subject. I thank all those who've commented for helping this process along. And my reading on near-death experiences, or NDEs, has also contributed to this. I'll come to that later. A couple of things are emerging more clearly for me from this discussion. First of all, I think we're dealing with two quite different concepts of God here. The argument from design and also causality leads some people to the idea that there must be some kind of intelligent creator at the base or origin of the universe. When Aquinas uses these arguments, for example, he always ends with a comment along these lines, "And this all men call God." In my video where I allowed the possibility that this universe is indeed designed, I pointed out, as did others in the discussion that followed, that this argument does not prove the existence of something that all men call God. It just points to a builder. End of story. It tells us nothing about the nature of this being or beings. We can't say whether they're morally good or particularly powerful, in the sense that is of having personal power rather than access to some kind of external power source, maybe some lab equipment. We can't claim that they're super intelligent. Maybe they have AI to help them. In other words, there's no logical or empirical imperative to attribute any of the omnis to them, unless, that is, they're using ChatGPT for Omni. There's nothing to indicate that they have any interest in us or any plan for us or any love for us. They may decide to end this project tomorrow to cut costs. I think there's probably an issue of definition here, if Aquinas is anything to go on. There are those who, like Aquinas, would call this being God, simply because it is the creator or the builder. They define this creator as God. Those of us who don't believe in God, though, would simply not accept this definition. Why? Because it's only a very, very limited part of what's meant when people use the word God, and probably not even the most important part. There's all this other stuff that arises from various religious traditions and from people's personal experiences. Proving that some being or beings manufactured our universe would not, in and of itself, provide any reason for worshipping, loving, or obeying such a being or beings. Those who would do so would be like fruit flies in the lab who decided to worship the scientists and lab techs. After all, they provide lots of food and opportunities for sex. A few necessary deaths along the way is a small price to pay, surely. But I don't want to be a fruit fly. But all of this has absolutely nothing to do with the other concept of God. And this is where the near-death experiences come into play. Many people who have an NDE describe being bathed in some kind of loving light or presence, or floating in some kind of endless ocean of love. Warm and fuzzy experiences of various kinds. They may or may not attribute this experience to God. It's not really surprising that people who are going through the process of dying or nearly dying might experience this enormous sense of comfort. Who wouldn't want that, right? I don't think these experiences are very different from the experiences that many mystics have of being immersed in some kind of universal love, or however they might choose to describe it. I think those who are investigating NDEs might well do some comparative studies with those who have such experiences without their subjects having to, die. It also seems to me that what people are describing is very womb-like. At least I imagine that's what being in the womb might feel like, floating in an ocean of love. I don't actually recall my time in the womb, but maybe some primitive part of my brain does. It would hardly be surprising if, when faced with imminent death, our deep unconscious brought this experience into the foreground. So these mystical experiences are the other way in which people talk about God, some kind of all-encompassing, loving presence. But what do these two ideas of God have in common? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Sure, some people might connect the two, but there's no compelling reason to do so. There's no reason to think that this creator being is also some kind of ocean of warmth and love. Quite the opposite, in fact. It generally leads to a very remote, uninvolved concept of God. And there's no reason to think that this all-encompassing ocean of love and warmth has anything at all to do with the creation of the universe. And I doubt that this even comes into the minds of those who have this experience. They have no interest at all in logical arguments. Also, I might add, neither of these concepts of God has much to do with any of the specifics of the religious traditions. So what do I think about this experience of being embraced by this warm, loving light or ocean or however people try to explain it? I have, in the past, had this kind of experience myself. Many people haven't, and they look at you as if you're weird if you talk about it. It's a great experience. Who wouldn't want this kind of experience when going through the process of dying or even in any other terribly traumatic event? I would strongly recommend such a dissociative experience in such circumstances. I imagine there are drugs that can induce similar experiences. I don't think these experiences are very difficult to understand in psychological terms. For me, the experience of the womb makes sense. However, people often express the desire to be floating in this ocean of bliss forever. Well, I think after a while they might have other ideas. I think this would become a nightmare after a while. I want to do things and not just float around in bliss. Aldous Huxley, in his dystopian novel Brave New World, describes a drug which he calls soma, which suspends people in a perpetual state of bliss. Look, I could appreciate the capacity to pop into a state of bliss occasionally as a kind of mental vacation, but as a permanent state of being? No thanks. But I digress. My takeaway point here is that when people try to prove the existence of God on the one hand or debunk these arguments on the other, they're not talking about God in this experiential sense. To my mind, proving the existence of such a being does not prove the existence of something which all men call God. For those for whom it does, it only does so because they've already predefined such a creator as God. They only find what they put there to start with. And none of this touches those who believe in God because of personal experiences, particularly these mystical experiences I've described. They don't give a shit about whether this being created the universe. So the argument won't affect them either way. I think I understand those experiences without having to refer to God, but that's a whole other story.